There are some movies you remember because they were brilliant, some because they were terrible, and then there are movies you remember because, even years later, you still cannot quite explain what they were. For a certain generation, John Carter belongs in that third category. You might remember the posters more clearly than the story. A shirtless guy, some strange creatures, a desert that looked like Mars, and a title that sounded less like a science fiction epic and more like the name of somebody your parents worked with. In 2012, Disney released John Carter into a world that had already started teaching audiences exactly what a blockbuster was supposed to look like. There were superheroes with recognizable logos, fantasy franchises with established fan bases, and science fiction movies that announced their identities before you even saw the trailer. John Carter had none of that clarity. It was expensive, strange, old-fashioned, and difficult to explain in a sentence. And that confusion mattered. Because Disney did not simply release a movie that audiences failed to understand. It released a movie whose identity seemed to frighten the company responsible for selling it. The title itself became a problem. The marketing changed direction. The trailers struggled to communicate whether this was fantasy, science fiction, romance, action, or some forgotten relic from another era. And if you were a kid watching all of this unfold, the experience could feel almost surreal. You knew there was a movie called John Carter. You knew there were giant green aliens. You knew the main character could jump impossibly high. You knew something important was happening on Mars. But you did not necessarily know why you should care. That is a very different problem from making a bad movie. A bad movie can have a clear identity. John Carter had something much more dangerous in the modern blockbuster economy, an identity crisis. Looking back now, that confusion is strangely nostalgic. Because if you grew up around the Disney Channel era, when movie trailers appeared between cartoons and posters appeared in every theater lobby, you probably absorbed the message that John Carter was a giant flop before you ever watched it. The word failure arrived before the movie did. Its financial problems became the story. Its production budget became the punchline. Its box office performance became shorthand for corporate incompetence. And eventually, the movie itself almost disappeared underneath the legend of the disaster. But here is the thing worth remembering. You were not necessarily wrong to find the movie fascinating. You were not crazy for remembering the creatures, the landscapes, the strange jumping, the melancholy tone, or the feeling that you were watching something that somehow looked both ancient and futuristic. There was a movie underneath the marketing failure, and that movie was much stranger and more ambitious than its reputation suggested. To understand why it vanished so quickly, though, we have to stop talking about John Carter as a punchline and start talking about it as a business decision. Because the real story begins with a number. $250 million. That was the approximate production budget being discussed around the film, before the enormous cost of marketing and distribution was taken into account. And once that much money is attached to a movie, the question stops being simply whether the movie is good. The question becomes whether the entire machine around the movie knows what it is selling. We remember the confusion. But why did a film with a Pixar-level director and a massive budget vanish into thin air? The answer is buried in a ledger. The first thing to understand about John Carter is that its financial failure was not simply the result of audiences deciding they hated it. In fact, that explanation is almost too comforting because it makes the disaster sound clean. A studio spends too much money, audiences reject the film, and everybody moves on. Hollywood history is full of examples like that. But John Carter is more complicated. The film cost an enormous amount to produce, and its worldwide theatrical gross was nowhere near enough to justify the investment once theaters took their share and marketing costs were considered. Disney ultimately acknowledged a massive loss connected to the movie, with contemporary reporting putting the damage in the neighborhood of $200 million. That figure turned John Carter into one of the most notorious theatrical losses in Disney history. Yet even that number can obscure what actually happened. The movie was not a simple 250 million object sitting on a shelf. It was an ecosystem of salaries, visual effects, reshoots, physical production, advertising, international distribution, theater splits, merchandise expectations, and corporate opportunity cost. When you hear that a movie made hundreds of millions of dollars and still lost money, that sounds absurd until you remember that a blockbuster does not keep every dollar it earns. The studio has to share box office revenue with exhibitors, while the marketing campaign can consume another enormous amount. A film this expensive does not merely need to make money. It needs to make a lot of money very quickly. And John Carter was never positioned to do that with the kind of certainty Disney needed. This distinction matters because it allows us to separate two ideas that have been welded together for years: bad movie and badly managed asset. John Carter can be criticized as a movie. It has awkward exposition, an uneven tone, characters who sometimes feel underwritten, and stretches where the visual spectacle is more impressive than the storytelling. Those criticisms are legitimate. But none of them explain a loss of this magnitude by themselves. The deeper problem was that Disney inherited a property with enormous historical importance but very little contemporary brand recognition, then spent blockbuster money trying to turn that property into something audiences would instantly recognize. That is an incredibly difficult equation. The irony is that John Carter was not some random original screenplay invented in a conference room in 2010. It came from one of the foundational texts of modern speculative fiction. And that brings us to the strangest part of this entire story. The movie that looked derivative in 2012 was based on a book published almost exactly 100 years earlier. In 1912, Edgar Rice Burroughs introduced readers to A Princess of Mars, the first novel featuring John Carter and the world later known as Barsoom. Burroughs was already a major cultural force because of Tarzan, but his Martian adventure imagined a vocabulary of science fiction and fantasy that would echo through generations of filmmakers, writers, artists, and game designers. There is a man transported to another world. There are alien civilizations divided by culture and geography. There are princesses, warriors, ancient cities, strange creatures, advanced technology, lost empires, and a hero whose physical abilities change because the environment operates differently from Earth. None of this was new by the time John Carter reached theaters. That was precisely the problem. It was old enough to have influenced nearly everything audiences already loved. Every time you praise Star Wars for its originality, you are accidentally brushing against a lineage that runs through John Carter. If you love the sense of adventure in Raiders of the Lost Ark, the heroic fantasy of countless pulp stories, or the planetary romance of later science fiction cinema, you are living in a cultural landscape Burroughs helped shape. But influence creates a strange trap. Once an original idea becomes common vocabulary, the original can look like the imitation. That is what happened to John Carter. Imagine discovering a classic rock song after hearing decades of music that borrowed from it. You may hear the original and think it sounds familiar. The familiarity is real, but the direction of influence is backward. John Carter was not copying Star Wars. Star Wars came decades later. Avatar did not teach audiences to accept humans entering alien worlds. Burroughs had already imagined a version of that fantasy long before modern cinema had the technology to visualize it. Yet when Andrew Stanton's film arrived, audiences judged it through the visual language of the movies that had learned from Burroughs, not through the history that made Burroughs important. And that creates the central tragedy of the movie. John Carter was simultaneously too familiar and too unfamiliar. The ingredients felt recognizable, but the package did not. The film was drawing from an incredibly old tradition while arriving in a marketplace obsessed with novelty. It had aliens without a famous franchise. It had a princess without a Disney princess brand. It had a hero without superhero mythology. It had a massive world without decades of merchandising behind it. And it had a director whose greatest successes had been animated films about toys, fish, robots, and talking cars. That director was Andrew Stanton. Burroughs wrote the blueprint for science fiction, but Stanton had to bring it to life. This is where the translation from page to screen, and the risk, really begins. Andrew Stanton was not an obvious choice if you were thinking only in terms of conventional live-action blockbuster experience. He was one of the key creative figures at Pixar, a writer and director whose work had helped define the emotional language of modern computer animation. Finding Nemo had become one of Pixar's most beloved films. WALL-E had demonstrated that Stanton could build an enormous emotional experience around a protagonist who barely spoke. He understood visual storytelling, rhythm, character emotion, and the ability of animation to make audiences accept impossible worlds without constantly questioning their physical reality. But live action is different. In animation, every image is constructed. The director controls the environment, the movement, the lighting, the camera, the characters, and the rhythm with extraordinary precision. On a live-action production of this size, that control is distributed across hundreds of people, departments, technologies, locations, schedules, and financial decisions. Stanton wanted to make a real science fiction adventure, not another animated film. And that ambition is admirable. It is also where the project became vulnerable. John Carter represents a fascinating moment in the career of a filmmaker discovering that the instincts that made him successful in one medium do not automatically transfer to another. Stanton brought enormous confidence in storytelling, but the movie was being made inside an industrial system that demanded more than storytelling. It needed positioning. It needed a marketing identity. It needed a star whose name could carry a global opening weekend. It needed executives to know exactly which audience they were targeting. It needed the movie to look expensive without looking generic. And above all, it needed the studio to believe in its weirdness. Instead, the film arrived at a point when Disney was becoming increasingly focused on recognizable intellectual property. The Marvel acquisition had changed the company's relationship with franchise entertainment. Pirates of the Caribbean had demonstrated the power of recurring blockbuster characters. Pixar had become an established brand. And Disney's own animated properties were carrying enormous cultural recognition. John Carter did not have that advantage. Stanton was attempting something that increasingly looked out of step with the corporate future. The film was based on an influential book, but the audience did not necessarily know the book. It was science fiction, but the title did not communicate that. It was fantasy, but the marketing did not fully embrace that either. It was an epic adventure, but it did not have a familiar cinematic icon at its center. This was not simply a creative gamble. It was a branding gamble. And the more you look at the production, the more obvious it becomes that somebody needed to answer one basic question: what exactly is John Carter? The movie itself actually has an answer. It is a planetary romance. It is pulp adventure filtered through modern visual effects. It is a melancholy story about grief wrapped inside a gigantic action spectacle. And once you understand that, Barsoom starts to become much more interesting. Because one of the reasons John Carter still looks better than its reputation suggests is that the filmmakers did not treat Mars as a generic CGI playground. They wanted it to feel inhabited. They wanted you to believe that people had been living, fighting, trading, worshipping, and dying on this planet long before John Carter arrived. Barsoom is not simply a background. It is a civilization. The physical production reflects that goal. The film combines extensive digital environments and creatures with costumes, sets, props, practical elements, location photography, and physical textures that give the world weight. The Tharks are especially important here. Their bodies are digital, but the culture around them is tactile. Their weapons, architecture, clothing, rituals, and movements all suggest a society rather than a collection of effects shots. Their multiple arms are not just a visual joke. They affect how they fight, communicate, and occupy space. Their language is not presented as random alien noise. It gives them a sense of identity. Even the empty landscapes are designed to feel like places where somebody has lived before. This is what modern viewers sometimes notice when they return to the movie on streaming or home video. The spectacle that looked overwhelming or artificial in 2012 can feel surprisingly grounded now. Part of that comes from changing technology. Another part comes from the fact that visual effects age in strange ways. Sometimes a movie looks dated because it relied too heavily on the visual trends of its release year. Other times the underlying design is strong enough that the technology becomes less distracting with time. John Carter benefits from the second category more often than people remember. The filmmakers were not simply asking, how do we make Mars look cool? They were asking, what would it feel like to live here? That distinction matters. A believable world needs friction. It needs dust, wear, damaged buildings, cultural differences, and objects that appear to have histories. Barsoom has those things. The planet is dying, and the civilization reflects that. Water is precious. Cities feel ancient. Technology exists beside decay. Political conflicts are tied to resources and survival. This is not the clean, empty future of a showroom. It is a civilization running out of time. And that brings us to the character who makes the entire movie work, even when the script occasionally struggles to explain itself, John Carter himself. At first glance, Carter looks like another impossibly muscular action hero. He jumps higher than everyone else, fights armies, attracts a princess, and eventually becomes a legendary warrior. But that description misses the emotional center. John Carter is not a man searching for glory. He is a man who has already decided that glory is meaningless. When we meet him, he is carrying grief. He has lost the people and life that once gave him purpose, and he has withdrawn from the world around him. His refusal to fight is not cowardice. It is exhaustion. He does not want to become a hero because he has already experienced enough loss to believe that heroism is just another word for suffering. This is why his transformation on Mars is more interesting than the standard Chosen One narrative suggests. Barsoom does not simply give Carter superhuman abilities. It gives him a reason to care again. The planet's lower gravity allows him to leap enormous distances, but emotionally, the important thing is that he is forced into relationships he cannot escape. He encounters the Tharks. He meets Dejah Thoris. He discovers that other people are depending on him. And slowly, reluctantly, he begins to understand that refusing to care is not the same thing as being free from pain. If you watched John Carter as a kid, you may have remembered the jumping before you remembered the grief. That is understandable. The movie is wrapped in spectacular imagery. But the melancholy underneath it is what gives the film its unusual personality. Carter is not a superhero trying to become more powerful. He is a grieving man trying to decide whether life is still worth participating in. The movie does not always articulate that theme as elegantly as it could, but it is there. It is also why Taylor Kitsch's performance deserves more generosity than it usually receives. Kitsch was asked to play a character who spends much of the film resisting the emotional expectations of a traditional blockbuster hero. Carter is guarded, frustrated, sarcastic, and frequently overwhelmed. He is not constantly delivering heroic speeches. That restraint can read as blankness if you expect a conventional action star performance, but there is a different interpretation. Carter is emotionally shut down because the character is supposed to be emotionally shut down. The problem is that the marketing sold the film primarily as spectacle, making the quieter performance easier to misunderstand. Dejah Thoris, played by Lynn Collins, is similarly caught between two versions of the movie. She is a princess, scientist, political figure, and warrior, but the marketing often reduced the character to the familiar image of the exotic science fiction heroine. Inside the movie, she has more agency than that image suggests. She understands the politics of Barsoom, participates in scientific discovery, and repeatedly pushes Carter to confront the consequences of his choices. The supporting cast also helps establish the world, especially Willem Dafoe as Tars Tarkas, the Thark leader whose relationship with Carter becomes one of the emotional anchors of the story. Tars Tarkas is funny, dignified, wounded, and capable of affection, which makes the Tharks feel like characters rather than visual effects. That distinction becomes increasingly important when we examine the film's visual language. We know why Carter is fighting. Now let's look at how he fights, and how the camera captures that impossible scale. One of the easiest ways to underestimate John Carter is to remember individual effects shots instead of the way the film constructs scale. Scale is difficult to create because the audience has to understand the relationship between bodies, environments, architecture, and movement. A giant creature standing beside a human does not automatically feel giant. A huge city does not automatically feel enormous. The camera has to teach your eye how big everything is. John Carter often does this through composition and movement. The Tharks have unusual proportions, and their bodies occupy space differently from humans. Their forearms create distinctive silhouettes during combat. Their height changes the visual relationship between them and Carter. The architecture of Barsoom uses large vertical spaces and open horizons to make the world feel bigger than the characters. And the film repeatedly places human figures against landscapes that dwarf them. These choices may not have been revolutionary, but they were effective. More importantly, they demonstrate why the visual effects deserve a more serious conversation. The Tharks are difficult characters to animate because they need to convey personality through non-human bodies. A purely realistic approach would have made them intimidating but emotionally distant. A purely cartoonish approach would have destroyed the seriousness of the world. The solution is a balance. Their faces retain enough human expressiveness for audiences to read emotion, while their bodies remain unmistakably alien. That is the invisible art of visual effects. When it works, you stop thinking about the technical process and simply accept the character. You do not pause to admire every frame because the movie has already taught your brain to believe what it sees. This is one reason John Carter can surprise viewers who return to it years later. You may notice that the effects are not flawless, but you also notice how rarely the movie's best digital work demands attention for its own sake. The visual effects serve the world. They are not always trying to become the world. And then there is the action. The film's most memorable sequences take advantage of Carter's jumping ability to create movement that would be impossible on Earth. Instead of treating his powers as a simple super-strength gimmick, the choreography builds around the altered physics. Carter launches himself across enormous spaces, lands with extraordinary force, and moves through battles with a physicality that is distinct from both superhero cinema and traditional sword and sandal adventure. The editing can become frantic, and some sequences lack the clean visual geography of the best modern action films, but the underlying concept remains strong. Carter fights differently because he exists differently on Barsoom. That is world building through action. And underneath all of it is a score that gives the movie something the marketing never quite found: identity. Michael Giacchino's music is one of the most underappreciated elements of John Carter. His score understands that this world needs to feel ancient and mythic without becoming humorless. The music moves between grandeur, mystery, romance, tension, and melancholy, creating emotional continuity across a story that contains a lot of information. That matters because strange worlds need musical language. When you enter a fictional civilization, your brain needs signals telling you how to feel about it. Is this place dangerous? Sacred? Beautiful? Dying? Hopeful? Giacchino's score repeatedly answers those questions before the dialogue does. The themes have the sweep you expect from an epic adventure, but there is also a sadness running underneath them. That sadness fits Carter. He arrives on Mars as a man who has stopped believing in his own future, and the music often makes Barsoom feel like a place carrying the weight of its own history. It is not merely a new world waiting to be conquered. It is a world that has already suffered. This is why the score can linger in your memory even when individual plot details become fuzzy. You may not remember exactly why Carter was running across a battlefield, but you remember the feeling of the music swelling as the horizon opened. You remember that Barsoom felt impossibly large. You remember the sense that something ancient was happening. That emotional continuity is especially valuable because the movie's marketing never gave audiences a consistent emotional message. The film was trying to be an epic romance, a science fiction adventure, a fantasy, a comedy, a war story, and a character drama. The score was one of the few elements capable of holding all those identities together. But while the filmmakers were trying to build a coherent world, Disney was facing a completely different problem. How do you sell it? And this is where the story stops being a production history and becomes a corporate autopsy. There is a temptation to believe that a movie's marketing campaign simply reflects the movie that already exists. It does not. Marketing creates a version of the movie inside the audience's head before the audience ever buys a ticket. For John Carter, that version was unstable. Disney had inherited a title with almost no immediate mainstream recognition. The source material was famous among science fiction historians but not among the general audience. The name John Carter could refer to almost anything. There was no obvious genre in the title. No iconic object. No recognizable villain. No familiar fictional universe. Even the word Mars was eventually removed from the main title, leaving simply John Carter. That decision is easy to criticize in hindsight because John Carter sounds radically less distinctive than John Carter of Mars. The longer title immediately tells you that this person belongs to another world. The shorter title could be a historical drama, a detective story, a western, or a biography. In a crowded marketplace, clarity is everything. Yet Disney's hesitation is understandable if you look at the broader cultural context. Science fiction was not always a safe label. Executives had watched expensive genre films struggle when audiences did not connect with them. The studio wanted a four-quadrant blockbuster, but the marketing also seemed reluctant to fully embrace the eccentricity that made the film different. The campaign emphasized action, spectacle, and attractive people, but those are not enough to create a unique identity. Audiences had seen action. They had seen spectacle. They had seen aliens. They had seen desert planets. They had seen princesses. What they had not seen was this particular combination, presented with confidence. There is an important correction to make here, though. Stories sometimes circulate claiming that a specific 2011 focus group loved John Carter but could not remember the title, leading directly to Disney removing Mars from the branding. That makes for a compelling insider anecdote, but it is better treated cautiously because the publicly available record does not establish such a simple cause and effect story. The larger truth does not require the anecdote. Disney's marketing genuinely struggled to communicate the film, and the title genuinely became less descriptive. The problem was real even if the most dramatic version of the story has been repeated beyond what the evidence can firmly support. This distinction matters because the corporate failure becomes more interesting when we stop looking for one villainous decision. There was no single executive who pressed a button labeled "Destroy John Carter." The failure came from accumulation. The movie was expensive. The property was obscure. The title was generic. The marketing was uncertain. The lead actor was not yet a proven global star. The director was making his first live-action feature. The film arrived in a marketplace increasingly dominated by established franchises. And the studio had enormous expectations for a project that did not naturally fit its brand. That is how blockbusters collapse. Not always through one catastrophic mistake, but through dozens of reasonable decisions that become disastrous when combined. Disney was also competing against an audience that had become extraordinarily sophisticated about visual spectacle. Avatar had changed expectations for science fiction world building. The Marvel films were changing expectations for interconnected characters and recognizable branding. The Lord of the Rings trilogy had demonstrated how fantasy could become an event. Even films that were not directly comparable had trained audiences to understand what a major franchise launch looked like. John Carter arrived without that infrastructure. It asked viewers to learn a mythology from scratch while spending at a scale usually reserved for properties that already had millions of fans. That is an enormous risk. And here is where the unfair comparison begins. If you watched John Carter after seeing Star Wars, Avatar, or modern superhero movies, you could easily conclude that the movie was derivative. The designs look familiar. The desert setting looks familiar. The alien civilizations look familiar. The romance between an outsider and a powerful woman looks familiar. The political conflict looks familiar. The strange creatures look familiar. But familiarity is exactly what you should expect from a story that helped establish those conventions. John Carter was not late to the party because it copied everyone else. It was late to the party because Hollywood had spent decades throwing parties inspired by its source material. Think about the strange historical position of A Princess of Mars. Burroughs published it before television, before sound cinema, before the modern concept of a summer blockbuster, before the space age, before computers, and before most of the visual language we now associate with science fiction existed. He was writing planetary adventure at a time when Mars itself was still wrapped in scientific mystery. The idea of canals on Mars had captured public imagination. The planet was close enough to inspire speculation but distant enough to become a canvas for fantasy. Burroughs took that fascination and built a world around it. By the time Stanton adapted the material, Mars was no longer an unknown frontier. It was a familiar cinematic setting. Audiences had seen countless versions of alien planets. The original sense of discovery was gone. This is the tragedy of being influential. Your innovations become invisible once everyone else adopts them. Star Wars can feel like the definitive space opera because it took influences from mythology, serial adventures, samurai cinema, westerns, and pulp fiction and transformed them into something new. Avatar can feel revolutionary because James Cameron used modern technology to create a world audiences had never seen in quite that way. John Carter was caught between those eras. Its DNA was foundational, but its presentation was modern enough to be judged as contemporary entertainment. It could not compete with the novelty of the films that had learned from it. In that sense, John Carter was a victim of its own success. The very tropes that once made the Barsoom stories imaginative had become the language of blockbuster cinema. And yet there is another reason the comparison feels unfair. Star Wars and Avatar did not have to spend their entire opening weekend explaining why they deserved to exist. Their identities were immediately legible. Star Wars promised a galaxy. Avatar promised Pandora. John Carter promised a man named John Carter. That may sound like a small distinction, but in blockbuster marketing, it is enormous. A title is not just a label. It is an invitation. John Carter asks you to know who John Carter is. John Carter of Mars tells you why you should be curious. The difference between those two titles is the difference between a character and a premise. And for a movie built around an unfamiliar world, the premise was essential. The financial collapse that followed became part of the mythology. Headlines focused on the enormous loss. Analysts questioned Disney's strategy. Executives were forced to explain how a company with such a powerful entertainment portfolio could produce such a spectacular failure. The director's transition from Pixar to live action became part of the conversation. The marketing became a case study. The movie itself became almost secondary. This is one of the cruelest things that can happen to a film. Once the story of its failure becomes more famous than the film, every subsequent conversation begins with a conclusion. You are not watching John Carter anymore. You are watching the 200 million loss. You are watching the infamous Disney mistake. You are watching the movie that supposedly proved original science fiction was dead. But box office failure does not tell you what a movie feels like. It tells you how a business outcome turned out. Those are related questions, but they are not identical. A movie can fail commercially and succeed artistically. A movie can succeed commercially and fail artistically. A movie can even fail on both levels while remaining culturally interesting. John Carter occupies an unusual middle ground. It is flawed. It is overstuffed. It occasionally feels like several different movies fighting for control. Its exposition can be clumsy. Some of the humor feels like it belongs to another version of the film. The romance does not always have enough breathing room. The villainous machinery can become confusing. But the ambition is genuine. The world is specific. The production design has personality. The visual effects frequently serve the story rather than distracting from it. The score gives the film emotional coherence. And at its center is a surprisingly sad character study about a man who does not want to be saved. Those qualities are not enough to turn John Carter into a flawless masterpiece. They are enough to make the movie worth remembering. That distinction is important because nostalgia can sometimes make us defensive. If you loved John Carter as a kid, you do not need to pretend it has no weaknesses. You do not need to rewrite history and claim that every critic was wrong. Your nostalgia makes sense even if the movie has problems. In fact, the ability to admit those problems can make the affection stronger. You can say, yes, this scene is awkward. Yes, the plot becomes complicated. Yes, the marketing was terrible. And yes, I still love the feeling of watching this world come alive. That is not intellectual dishonesty. That is how relationships with movies actually work. We do not love films only because they are perfect. Sometimes we love them because of the moment in our lives when we found them, the images that stayed with us, or the strange emotional experience they gave us that no other movie quite replicated. John Carter belongs to that category for many viewers. It is a flawed masterpiece in the most literal sense, not a perfect film, but a film whose flaws exist alongside a level of ambition that deserves respect. And perhaps the most revealing thing about its failure is what happened to Hollywood afterward. The era when a studio could spend enormous sums on an unfamiliar high-concept science fiction property was rapidly disappearing. Franchise logic was becoming stronger. Existing intellectual property became more valuable because it reduced uncertainty. A known character could sell toys. A known universe could support sequels. A recognizable logo could do some of the marketing work before the first trailer even aired. John Carter represented the old model: build a world, introduce a character, spend huge money, and hope audiences fall in love. The new model was different. Start with something audiences already love, then expand it. That does not mean John Carter was literally the last original blockbuster, because Hollywood continued to produce original films afterward. But its failure became symbolic of a shift in risk tolerance. Studios became increasingly interested in properties that could become cinematic universes rather than one enormous standalone gamble. John Carter looked like an old-fashioned bet in a market learning to prefer portfolios over singular visions. That is why its story remains fascinating. The movie did not merely fail at the box office. It arrived at the precise moment when the economic logic of blockbuster filmmaking was changing. A century after Burroughs created Barsoom, the film adaptation became a museum piece of the very storytelling tradition it was trying to revive. It carried the DNA of pulp adventure into a cinematic marketplace that had already metabolized that DNA and turned it into franchise machinery. The result was a strange contradiction. John Carter looked familiar because its ancestors had become the foundation of modern spectacle. It looked expensive because Disney had invested like it was launching a new franchise. It looked old-fashioned because its emotional structure was built around character, romance, adventure, and world-building rather than a carefully engineered cinematic universe. And it failed because the audience was never given a compelling reason to understand any of that. So if you remember John Carter as the movie that appeared on television one afternoon and made you wonder why Mars had four-armed aliens, you were not alone. If you thought the movie looked cool even though everyone said it was terrible, that reaction was not irrational. If you still remember the sound of Giacchino's music, the sight of Carter leaping across the landscape, the strange beauty of Barsoom, or the first time you saw Tars Tarkas and realized this movie was trying to create an entire civilization, that memory is worth taking seriously. The film's reputation was shaped by a business disaster, but the art inside it did not disappear. In fact, time has given John Carter something it desperately lacked in 2012, distance. We can now look past the opening weekend. We can separate the production from the marketing. We can separate the title from the story. We can separate the $250 million price tag from the actual images on screen. And when we do that, a different movie emerges. Not a secret masterpiece that was unfairly persecuted by critics. Not a perfect adaptation that executives somehow sabotaged. Something more interesting. A flawed, expensive, ambitious, melancholy piece of old-school science fiction that arrived in the wrong era, under the wrong title, with the wrong expectations, and almost no chance of being understood on its own terms. That is the heartbreak of John Carter. It did not fail because nobody had talent. It failed because too many talented people were trying to solve different problems at the same time. Burroughs had created the mythology. Stanton wanted to honor the adventure while giving it emotional weight. The production team built a physical and digital world with genuine texture. Giacchino gave it a musical identity. The performers tried to make strange characters feel human. But the corporate machine needed certainty, and John Carter was fundamentally uncertain. It was uncertain in genre, uncertain in branding, uncertain in audience, uncertain in franchise potential, and uncertain in the marketplace. Disney wanted an event. Stanton made something closer to a romantic epic. The audience was promised spectacle but received melancholy. The studio wanted recognizable value, but the film's greatest strength was that it was difficult to categorize. And that gap swallowed it. So, if the history books call it a disaster, and our hearts call it a favorite, which one is the truth? Both. And that's what makes it a classic. A classic does not have to be perfect, and it does not have to win its opening weekend. Sometimes a classic is simply a movie that survives the story told about its failure. John Carter has survived. It survived the headlines, the jokes, the financial numbers, the marketing confusion, and the years in which its very title became synonymous with bad business. What remains is a strange little miracle hidden inside a massive corporate mistake. There is Barsoom, still glowing under alien skies. There are the Tharks, still moving through their ancient cities. There is Dejah Thoris, still trying to save a dying world. There is Carter, still carrying his grief until he finally understands that caring about someone is worth the risk of losing them. And there is you, watching it years later and realizing that maybe the thing you remembered was not the disaster at all. Maybe you remembered the movie. That matters. Because nostalgia is not always about pretending the past was better. Sometimes nostalgia is the moment you finally understand why something from your past mattered to you. Maybe John Carter was never the perfect blockbuster Disney wanted. Maybe it was never going to become the next Star Wars. Maybe it was too late, too expensive, too strange, and too badly explained. But that does not make your affection embarrassing. It makes your memory part of the film's afterlife. A movie can lose money and still gain meaning. It can fail commercially and still find people who carry it with them. It can become a warning to a studio while becoming a comfort movie to an audience. And perhaps that is the final irony of John Carter. The movie Disney spent so much money trying to turn into an event became something much smaller and, in a way, much more personal. It became a rediscovery. A forgotten blockbuster waiting on a streaming menu. A childhood memory that turns out to be more complicated than you remembered. A film you return to expecting a punchline and find yourself defending the craft instead. So go ahead and admit it. If you still love John Carter, you are allowed to love it. You do not have to defend every scene. You do not have to pretend the script is flawless. You do not have to deny the financial disaster. You can acknowledge all of it and still look at Barsoom and feel that old sense of wonder. Because maybe the real failure was never that John Carter was a bad movie. Maybe the failure was that Hollywood did not know how to introduce an old idea as something new, and did not know how to sell a strange, sincere adventure in an age increasingly built around familiar brands. Burroughs created Barsoom in 1912, long before anyone could imagine the modern blockbuster machine. A century later, that machine finally caught up with him, spent a fortune trying to recreate his dream, and then could not figure out how to explain why the dream mattered. The result was a heartbreak, a cautionary tale, and, for a certain generation, something even more valuable, a lost classic waiting to be found again. And maybe that is where John Carter becomes more interesting than the usual story of a box office bomb. Because once you stop asking whether the movie deserved to succeed and start asking what kind of movie it actually was, the contradictions become impossible to ignore. It was marketed like a new franchise, but emotionally it behaved like an old adventure film. It was produced with the resources of a modern effects spectacle, but its storytelling instincts came from pulp fiction that was already a century old. It had the visual vocabulary of the blockbuster era while carrying the melancholy of a story written before the blockbuster even existed. That mismatch is not a minor detail. It is the entire movie. Think about what audiences were being trained to expect in 2012. The blockbuster was no longer simply a movie. It was becoming an ecosystem. A successful film could generate sequels, toys, video games, television appearances, theme park attractions, online discussions, conventions, collectible figures, and years of speculation. Characters were no longer just characters. They were potential assets. Worlds were no longer simply settings. They were intellectual property waiting to be expanded. John Carter did not naturally fit that model. Its world was enormous, but its audience was uncertain. Its mythology was deep, but the average viewer did not know it existed. Its characters had history on the page, but not in the public imagination. There was no generation of children who had grown up with John Carter action figures. There was no instantly recognizable theme song. There was no cultural shorthand that allowed someone to say, you know, the John Carter movies, and have everyone immediately understand what they meant. Instead, Disney had to explain everything from the beginning. And explaining everything is expensive. This is something we often forget when discussing blockbuster failures. Familiarity is one of the most valuable forms of marketing a studio can possess. If you release a Batman movie, you do not need to explain who Batman is. If you release a Spider-Man movie, the red suit does some of the work for you. If you release another Star Wars film, the opening crawl, the lightsabers, the music, and the title itself activate decades of cultural memory. John Carter had none of those shortcuts. The studio was asking audiences to invest emotionally in a character whose name sounded completely ordinary, enter a planet they had never heard of, learn a collection of alien civilizations, understand a political conflict, accept unusual physics, follow a romance, and care about a protagonist who initially does not want to participate in the adventure. That is a lot of homework for a movie that is supposed to feel like an event. And yet the movie itself is surprisingly confident once it gets moving. That is the strange thing about watching John Carter today. The film does not feel embarrassed by its world. The characters behave as though Barsoom is real. The Tharks are not introduced as a joke. Their culture has rules, hierarchies, traditions, and emotional history. The cities have names. The kingdoms have conflicts. The technology has consequences. The characters have reasons to fear the future. The movie assumes that you will eventually catch up. Modern franchise filmmaking often works in the opposite direction. It gives you a familiar symbol first and the mythology second. John Carter gives you mythology first and asks you to discover why the symbol matters. That is a harder sell. It is also a more old-fashioned kind of storytelling. And maybe that is why the film can feel strangely refreshing now. When you watch it without the pressure of its 2012 reputation, you begin noticing how much of its appeal comes from the simple pleasure of exploration. Carter walks into a new world, and the movie wants you to look around. It wants you to notice the architecture, the creatures, the clothing, the weapons, the landscapes, and the social differences between civilizations. That instinct feels almost quaint today. We are used to cinematic universes that arrive with enormous explanatory machinery already attached. A new character might be introduced in one film, receive a cameo in another, appear in a streaming series, and eventually headline a spin-off. The audience is trained to think about what comes next. John Carter mostly wants you to look at what is happening now. That difference is important. There is something almost melancholy about watching the movie with the knowledge that no sequel followed. The ending feels different when you know there will not be another chapter. The characters do not exist inside an expanding universe anymore. They are trapped inside one film, preserved exactly as they were when the production ended. In another context, that might be disappointing. Here, it adds to the feeling that you are watching a lost artifact. Barsoom becomes a world that exists for roughly 2 hours and then disappears again. That is almost appropriate for a story about a dying planet. The setting itself carries a sense of exhaustion. Barsoom is not presented as a pristine paradise waiting for the hero to arrive. It is a civilization under pressure. Resources are disappearing. Political powers are maneuvering for survival. Ancient traditions are colliding with new technologies. People are fighting over what remains. Even the visual palette contributes to that feeling. The reds, browns, oranges, and dusty metallic surfaces create an environment that feels weathered rather than futuristic. This is not a gleaming science fiction utopia. It is a world where technology has existed long enough to become ordinary. People do not stop and marvel at every machine. They use it. That is an important piece of world building. When a fictional world is believable, the characters rarely behave as though they know they are inside a fictional world. They have jobs. They have arguments. They have political problems. They fall in love. They get tired. They worry about tomorrow. John Carter occasionally loses focus because it has so much mythology to introduce, but its best moments understand this principle. Barsoom works when it stops trying to impress you and simply allows you to live there for a few minutes. And this is where the Tharks become especially valuable. Without them, Barsoom could have become another collection of beautiful landscapes populated by generic aliens. The Tharks give the planet social texture. Tars Tarkas is not simply the biggest creature in the room. He has an emotional arc. He has lost status. He has complicated relationships with the traditions of his people. He is capable of humor and tenderness, which immediately separates him from the standard image of the monstrous alien warrior. The Tharks also challenge Carter's understanding of strength. Carter initially sees himself as someone who has withdrawn from human conflict. Yet among the Tharks, he discovers that strength is not simply physical. Leadership matters. Loyalty matters. Community matters. Courage can mean choosing to care when caring makes you vulnerable. That is the emotional language running underneath the spectacle. And it circles back to Carter's grief. This is perhaps the most misunderstood element of the film. John Carter's story is not really about a man discovering that he is special. It is about a man discovering that he is still alive. Those are not the same thing. A traditional blockbuster hero begins with a desire. They want revenge, justice, power, freedom, recognition, or some other concrete objective. Carter begins with absence. He has already lost the thing that gave his life meaning. That makes his refusal to fight more complicated. When other characters demand that he become a warrior, he does not simply say no because he is stubborn. He says no because he has learned that violence comes with consequences. He has experienced enough loss to believe that protecting people only creates more opportunities to lose them. Mars changes that equation. Not because Carter suddenly becomes morally perfect, but because Barsoom forces him to see that isolation is not the same thing as healing. That distinction makes his relationship with Dejah Thoris more important than the movie's marketing suggested. Their romance is not simply about attraction. Dejah represents a future Carter has convinced himself he no longer deserves. She is intelligent, determined, politically trapped, and emotionally invested in saving her world. Carter keeps trying to walk away from responsibility, while Dejah keeps reminding him that responsibility can be chosen rather than imposed. He does not fall in love because she is a princess. He falls in love because she gives him a reason to care again. That is a much sadder story. And it is one reason the movie has aged differently for viewers who first saw it as children. When you are younger, you tend to notice the obvious things. The jumping. The creatures. The swords. The princess. The battles. When you are older, you notice the man underneath the muscles. You notice how tired he is. You notice how often he tries to escape. You notice that his greatest fear is not death. It is attachment. Because once you care about someone, you can lose them. That idea gives the movie a surprisingly adult emotional center. It also explains why the film sometimes feels slower than modern blockbuster storytelling. It is not always trying to move you toward the next spectacle. Sometimes it is letting Carter sit inside his own resistance. That can be frustrating. But it can also be honest. Andrew Stanton came from a creative tradition that valued character emotion as much as spectacle. Pixar's greatest films often hide enormous emotional ideas inside accessible stories. Toys confront abandonment. Robots confront loneliness. Children confront grief. Monsters confront parenthood. John Carter attempts something similar. It takes a giant science fiction adventure and puts grief at its center. The problem is that live-action blockbuster audiences in 2012 were not necessarily expecting that. They were expecting an event. The marketing promised an event. The budget demanded an event. But the character wanted a funeral. That contradiction is fascinating. And it may explain why the film feels tonally unusual even when individual scenes work. It is constantly moving between two emotional registers. One says, "Look at this incredible world." The other says, "This man does not know if he wants to keep living inside it." Those ideas can coexist. But they do not always blend smoothly. That is one of the movie's genuine weaknesses. The script has so much mythology to communicate that emotional moments sometimes have to compete with exposition. Characters explain political situations while the audience is still trying to understand who belongs to which civilization. Names arrive quickly. Locations change. Motivations are introduced and then complicated. The story is not incomprehensible, but it is demanding. For a child watching it in 2012, that could be especially confusing. And this is where we should be careful with nostalgia. It is tempting to say that audiences simply didn't understand John Carter because they were too distracted by Marvel or because Disney marketed it badly. The reality is more complicated. The movie genuinely asks a lot from its audience. Some of the storytelling is messy. Some characters could have been developed more clearly. Some exposition could have been simplified. Some jokes clash with the seriousness of the surrounding material. The film is not secretly flawless. But those flaws do not invalidate the larger achievement. A movie can be imperfect and still be ambitious. In fact, ambition is often what makes imperfection interesting. There is a difference between a movie that fails because it has nothing to say and a movie that fails because it is trying to say too many things at once. John Carter belongs much closer to the second category. It wants to be a romance. It wants to be a war epic. It wants to be a planetary adventure. It wants to be a character study. It wants to establish a mythology. It wants to introduce alien cultures. It wants to make you laugh. It wants to create spectacle. And it wants to launch a franchise. That is an enormous amount of responsibility for one movie. You can feel the weight of it. Sometimes the film seems to be carrying its own expectations on its back. And that makes its financial collapse even more fascinating. Because when a $250 million movie fails, people often assume the answer must be obvious. The movie must have been terrible. The audience must have rejected it. The studio must have been foolish. But sometimes failure is not the result of one bad choice. Sometimes it is a collision between timing, expectations, economics, branding, and culture. John Carter was caught in that collision. Its source material belonged to 1912. Its production belonged to the early 2010s. Its financial expectations belonged to the franchise era. Its emotional instincts belonged to old adventure cinema. Its visual effects belonged to modern Hollywood. And its marketing seemed unsure which century it wanted to sell. That is why the movie is worth studying as more than a box office statistic. It is a snapshot of Hollywood changing in real time. The old blockbuster model was not disappearing overnight. It was being squeezed. The idea of spending enormous money on an unfamiliar story was becoming harder to justify. Audiences had more entertainment choices. International markets were increasingly important. Marketing costs were rising. Studios were becoming more dependent on recognizable intellectual property. And then there was the rise of cinematic universes. The success of Marvel demonstrated something powerful. You did not have to convince audiences to care about an entire world at once. You could introduce one character. Then another. Then another. Eventually, the audience would understand that these stories belonged to the same larger machine. The risk was distributed. John Carter attempted the opposite. It asked you to care about the whole universe immediately. There was no runway. No familiar superhero. No established screen mythology. No previous movie telling you that this world mattered. Everything depended on the audience saying yes on the first weekend. That is an incredibly fragile business model. And yet, for all the financial logic against it, the movie has one quality that many franchise films struggle to recover once they become too carefully engineered. It feels like somebody wanted to make it. That may sound strange considering how much corporate money was involved, but watch the details. There is genuine curiosity in the world design. There is affection in the creatures. There is effort in the costumes. There is specificity in the environments. There is a musical identity. There is a sincere attempt to make Carter's emotional journey matter. You can disagree with the execution while still recognizing the intent. And intent matters when discussing art. Because the easiest way to dismiss a movie is to reduce it to its weakest elements. John Carter has enough awkward scenes to make that easy. But if you judge it only by the awkward scenes, you miss the architecture around them. You miss the ambition. You miss the historical context. You miss what Burroughs was doing. You miss what Stanton was attempting. You miss the technical work. And you miss the strange fact that a movie inspired by a 1912 novel was being judged against films that had inherited its ideas. That is the irony at the center of its reputation. The audience was not seeing the origin. They were seeing the descendants. Imagine watching John Carter without knowing that a princess of Mars existed. You see the aliens and think of Star Wars. You see the planetary landscapes and think of Avatar. You see the princess and think of fantasy adventure. You see the sword fighting and think of every modern action franchise. You see the hero discovering another world and think of countless stories that came afterward. The movie looks derivative because culture has moved forward. But history moves backward. Influence does not announce itself to the audience experiencing the influenced work. That is why film history matters. It gives you the missing context. It lets you understand that originality is not always visible in the thing you are watching. Sometimes originality is hidden in the things that came before it. Burroughs was working in an era when science fiction had not yet settled into the visual grammar we recognize today. He helped create that grammar. The problem was that the 2012 audience had already learned it. That is the ultimate curse of a foundational work. You can be so influential that people stop noticing you were there first. And this is where John Carter becomes something close to tragic. Because the movie itself is trying to reconnect modern audiences with a story that helped create modern pop culture. But the only way it can do that is by looking like the pop culture it helped inspire. There is no visual shortcut around that paradox. Make it faithful to Burroughs, and it may look derivative. Modernize it too aggressively, and you risk losing the very qualities that made the source material historically important. Stanton chose a middle path. Sometimes that path works beautifully. Sometimes it produces a movie that feels trapped between eras. But the attempt itself is fascinating. The production design is particularly revealing. Instead of making Barsoom look like a futuristic city, the filmmakers give it history. Buildings appear weathered. Technology feels integrated into daily life. Clothing communicates status. Weapons have physical presence. The world has dirt. That dirt matters. It is one of the oldest tricks in production design. Clean surfaces look artificial. Where tells you that something has existed. A scratched table tells you people have eaten there. A damaged wall tells you something happened. A worn weapon tells you someone has used it. A costume that looks slightly dirty tells you the character has been moving through the world rather than standing inside a studio. Barsoom works best when it embraces those details. And then there are the creatures. The film's digital characters were built at a time when computer-generated imagery had already become extremely sophisticated, but before the modern explosion of photorealistic digital characters in every major franchise. That timing makes the work especially interesting. The Tharks need to be alien enough to feel like another species while expressive enough to carry emotional scenes. Their faces cannot simply behave like human faces because that would make them feel like actors wearing digital masks. But if the animators make them too restrained, the audience loses emotional connection. The result is a carefully controlled exaggeration. Their expressions are readable. Their movements have weight. Their bodies have a different physical rhythm. They occupy the frame differently from human characters. That is why Tars Tarkas works. He feels like a person who happens to have 4 arms rather than an effect designed to demonstrate technical capability. And that is the difference between visual effects and visual storytelling. Visual effects ask, can we create this? Visual storytelling asks, what does creating this allow us to communicate? John Carter occasionally gets distracted by the first question. But at its best, it understands the second. The film scale is also more impressive when you consider what the camera has to accomplish. Large environments are difficult because scale can become meaningless. If everything is enormous, nothing feels enormous. The movie solves this by repeatedly returning to human-sized reference points. Carter stands against massive landscapes. Buildings tower over people. The Tharks dwarf humans. Airships cross open spaces. Armies occupy enormous battlefields. These contrasts give the viewer a sense of proportion. And proportion creates awe. Awe is one of the oldest emotions in science fiction. Before science fiction became about superheroes and franchises, it was often about making the audience feel small. The stars are bigger than us. The universe is older than us. Other worlds may operate according to rules we do not understand. Barsoom works when John Carter remembers that. The planet is not just a place for Carter to conquer. It is something larger than him. That is another reason the melancholy tone matters. Carter begins the movie believing his own story is over. Barsoom proves that the universe does not care about his conclusion. Life continues. Other people still need him. Wars still happen. People still fall in love. A civilization still struggles to survive. His grief does not stop the world. Eventually, he has to decide whether he will allow grief to stop him. That is a surprisingly mature idea for a movie that was marketed to families. And maybe that is why adults can find something different in the movie years later. You watch it at 12 and remember the action. You watch it at 30 and recognize the exhaustion. You notice what it means to lose someone and then decide that avoiding future pain is not the same as living. You notice why Carter resists heroism. You notice why Dejah challenges him. You notice why Tars Tarkas matters. You notice why the movie feels sad even when people are flying through the air. That emotional shift is one of the gifts of revisiting childhood movies. The movie does not necessarily change. You do. And sometimes the movie becomes more interesting because of it. This is why dismissing nostalgia as blind affection is such a mistake. Nostalgia is not automatically saying, this movie is perfect. Sometimes nostalgia is saying, this movie reached me before I had the vocabulary to explain why. John Carter may be one of those movies. Maybe you did not know why you liked the strange green aliens. Maybe you did not know why the desert landscape stayed in your head. Maybe you did not know why the music made the world feel bigger. Maybe you did not know why Carter's loneliness felt different from the usual superhero heroism. You simply remembered the feeling. Years later, analysis gives that feeling a name. And that can be incredibly satisfying. It is like returning to a childhood house and finally understanding why a particular room felt important. The room did not change. Your perspective did. That is the emotional power of revisiting forgotten films. And John Carter deserves that kind of revisit. Not because it was secretly perfect. Not because every criticism was unfair. Not because Disney was the only reason it failed. But because the movie became trapped inside a narrative much larger than itself. The narrative was "This is the 250 million disaster." Once that phrase became dominant, every other conversation became harder. If you said the effects were impressive, someone could answer with the box office. If you said the world building was fascinating, someone could answer with the budget. If you said the performances were underrated, someone could answer with the reviews. The movie became a financial number wearing a costume. And that is not how art works. A film's commercial performance is part of its history. It is not the entirety of its meaning. The box office tells us what happened economically. It does not tell us what happened emotionally. It cannot measure how many children remembered Barsoom. It cannot measure how many viewers discovered the Burroughs novels afterward. It cannot measure the impact of a particular image on someone who later became interested in visual effects, costume design, animation, science fiction, or filmmaking. It cannot measure affection. And affection is one of the reasons movies survive. Commercial success gives a movie visibility. Love gives it longevity. Sometimes those things overlap. Sometimes they do not. John Carter is an example of the second. It failed loudly. Then it survived quietly. That quiet survival may actually be more interesting than a sequel would have been. Because without a franchise, the movie remained self-contained. It became something people could rediscover without needing to know 10 other films. You could watch it simply because you wanted to see Barsoom. You could return to it without worrying about continuity. You could remember it as its own thing. In an era when every blockbuster seems designed to lead somewhere else. There is something almost comforting about a movie that simply ends. It begins. It takes you somewhere strange. It gives its characters a crisis. It resolves that crisis. And then it stops. No post-credit announcement is required to justify the experience. No future project needs to validate what you just watched. That is old-fashioned. And perhaps that is exactly why it feels increasingly valuable. The modern blockbuster often asks, what comes next? John Carter asks, can you care about what is happening now? Those are different questions. And maybe the second one is becoming more important. Because the more Hollywood builds interconnected universes, the more difficult it becomes for individual movies to feel complete. Characters become introductions. Villains become placeholders. Stories become chapters. Emotional payoffs are postponed. John Carter has the opposite problem. It tries to put an entire universe inside one film. That makes it messy. But it also makes it sincere. The movie wants you to believe that Barsoom existed before Carter arrived and will continue after he leaves. That is a powerful feeling. It gives the fictional world depth. And it connects directly to Burroughs' original storytelling. The Barsoom books were not built around the idea that John Carter had discovered a blank canvas. The world already had civilizations. Already had history. Already had conflicts. Already had legends. Carter was the outsider. That distinction separates planetary romance from a simple chosen one fantasy. The hero does not create the world. He enters it. And the best adaptation choices preserve that. Carter's arrival changes things, but he does not instantly understand them. He has to learn. He makes mistakes. He misunderstands cultural differences. He initially interprets everything through the experiences he brought from Earth. That is another reason his relationship with the Tharks matters. He learns that his assumptions about strength, honor, and community are incomplete. And Tars Tarkas learns something from him as well. Their friendship works because neither character completely replaces the other. They influence each other. That is good adventure storytelling. It is also why the film's emotional moments often work better than its exposition. When characters simply talk about the history of Barsoom, the movie can become dense. When characters demonstrate their values through action, the world becomes clear. Carter choosing to protect someone tells you more about his transformation than a speech explaining his transformation. Tars Tarkas showing loyalty tells you more about Thark culture than a paragraph of dialogue. Dejah refusing to surrender tells you more about her character than a title calling her a princess. These are the moments that make the movie breathe. And they are the moments worth remembering. The larger tragedy is that the marketing could not easily sell any of this. Marketing wants a sentence. Art often needs an experience. What is John Carter? A man transported to Mars. A warrior with superhuman jumping abilities. A princess trying to save her kingdom. A dying civilization. A romance. A science fiction adventure. A story about grief. A pulp adaptation. A Disney blockbuster. A Pixar director's live-action debut. All of those descriptions are true. None of them fully explain the movie. And when a movie cannot be summarized cleanly, marketing departments often panic. They simplify. They remove complicated ideas. They focus on spectacle. They search for the most recognizable image. They try to make something strange look familiar. But in John Carter's case, familiarity was the enemy. The whole appeal was that this was supposed to feel like a forgotten adventure from another era. Instead of hiding that, the campaign might have needed to embrace it. Imagine selling John Carter as a rediscovered piece of pulp mythology. Imagine explaining that the story came from 1912. Imagine telling audiences that the movie was based on one of the foundational works of science fiction. Imagine making the age of the material part of the attraction rather than treating its unfamiliarity as a weakness. That would not guarantee success. Nothing would. But it would give the movie an identity. The problem was never simply that audiences did not know John Carter. The problem was that the campaign did not give them a compelling reason to want to know him. That is a critical distinction. Unknown does not mean unmarketable. Unknown can be exciting. Every successful franchise was unknown once. The question is whether the audience feels invited into the unknown. John Carter often felt like it was apologizing for being unknown. And audiences can sense uncertainty. When a studio does not seem confident in a movie, viewers become less likely to take the risk themselves. That is especially true with expensive theatrical releases. If you have one evening and a family to entertain, you want to know what you are buying. A recognizable title reduces that uncertainty. John Carter increased it. The title sounded generic. The trailers were inconsistent. The genre was difficult to classify. The marketing did not emphasize the literary history. And the movie carried a gigantic price tag. That combination was dangerous. The financial result was therefore not mysterious. It was predictable in retrospect. But hindsight can be cruel because it makes complicated failures look inevitable. They rarely are. People inside the production were making decisions with incomplete information. Executives were reacting to market trends. Marketers were testing messages. Filmmakers were trying to protect the movie's identity. Audiences were responding to what they were shown. Nobody knew exactly what would happen. The disaster only looks obvious because we know the ending. And that is why calling John Carter simply a bomb tells us almost nothing. It tells us what happened after release. It does not tell us why. It does not tell us what the film was trying to accomplish. It does not tell us what changed in Hollywood around it. It does not tell us why people still talk about it. And it definitely does not tell us why someone who saw it at 12 might still remember it at 30. That last part may be the most important. Because movies are not spreadsheets. You can calculate revenue. You can calculate losses. You can calculate production costs. You can calculate marketing expenses. You cannot calculate the value of a memory. A child sitting in a theater in 2012 does not know that the movie cost $250 million. They do not know how many executives approved the budget. They do not know how much the marketing campaign cost. They do not know what analysts will write about it tomorrow. They see Carter leap across the Martian landscape. They see Tars Tarkas. They hear Giacchino's music. They see Dejah standing against an alien city. And something inside them says, I want to remember this. That is the part of cinema the ledger cannot measure. And maybe that is why the film's reputation has slowly become more complicated. As the immediate embarrassment faded, the movie became available for reconsideration. People could watch it without the pressure of opening weekend. They could judge the film rather than the headline. They could compare it to the movie itself instead of the expectations attached to it. And that is when the strange truth begins to emerge. John Carter is not a masterpiece in the traditional sense. But it is not the disaster its reputation implies. It is something much more fascinating. It is a flawed blockbuster with a genuine soul. And those are becoming rarer. The film was trying to make you believe in another world. It wanted you to feel the scale. It wanted you to care about Carter. It wanted you to understand why Dejah mattered. It wanted the Tharks to feel like a civilization. It wanted the music to make the planet feel ancient. It wanted the final battles to feel consequential. It wanted Barsoom to stay with you after the credits. The movie did not accomplish all of that perfectly. But it accomplished enough. Enough to leave an impression. Enough to create nostalgia. Enough to justify another look. And perhaps the most generous way to view John Carter is not as a failed attempt at becoming the next Star Wars. It is as the last giant attempt to make something feel like an old-fashioned adventure without first proving that it could become a franchise. That is why the movie feels like a museum piece. Not because it is obsolete. Because it preserves a storytelling philosophy that Hollywood was already moving away from. The philosophy was simple. Find a strange story. Build a world. Hire talented people. Spend the money to make the world convincing. Put a character inside it. Hope audiences fall in love. That model still exists. But it became increasingly difficult to finance at the blockbuster level. The industry learned to ask different questions. What existing audience does this have? How many sequels can it support? Can we build merchandise around it? Can we create a cinematic universe? Can we reduce risk? Can we make the opening weekend predictable? John Carter was difficult to make predictable. And predictability became more valuable. That is the corporate lesson. But the artistic lesson is different. Risk is often where identity comes from. A movie can be safer and still be better. But if every decision is designed to reduce uncertainty, you can end up with films that are polished without being distinctive. John Carter's mistakes are distinctive. Its ambition is distinctive. Its awkwardness is distinctive. Its emotional weirdness is distinctive. Its world is distinctive. And that may be why people remember it. You rarely become nostalgic for something completely anonymous. You become nostalgic for something that had a personality. John Carter had one. It just took years for people to notice. And perhaps the final irony is that Disney did eventually become one of the most powerful companies in the world precisely because of its ability to manage recognizable intellectual property. Marvel became a global machine. Star Wars became a global machine. Pixar continued producing major animated films. Disney Animation revived its own classic brand. The company's strategy increasingly centered on assets that could live across multiple platforms. In that world, John Carter looks almost like an experiment from a different civilization. A giant studio spending hundreds of millions on a mostly unfamiliar science fiction hero sounds increasingly strange. But that strangeness is historically valuable. It shows us what Hollywood was willing to attempt before the current model became dominant. And that is why the movie deserves to be remembered. Not necessarily because it should have become a franchise. Not because the box office was secretly wrong. Not because every critic missed a masterpiece. But because it captures a moment when old-school adventure storytelling collided with modern blockbuster economics. That collision produced a failure. But it also produced a movie. And those are not the same thing. The failure belongs to the business history. The movie belongs to the audience. That distinction allows you to reclaim it. You can look at the financial numbers and understand why Disney was disappointed. You can look at the marketing and recognize how badly the film was positioned. You can look at the screenplay and identify its weaknesses. And then you can still sit down and enjoy the damn thing. You are allowed to do that. You are allowed to watch Carter leap across Barsoom and feel something. You are allowed to hear Giacchino's score and remember being younger. You are allowed to appreciate the Tharks. You are allowed to admit the movie is messy. You are allowed to call it underrated without pretending it is perfect. That is what a mature relationship with nostalgia looks like. It does not require denial. It requires context. And context changes everything. Once you know where John Carter came from, the movie stops looking like a random imitation. Once you understand Burroughs, the visual similarities to later science fiction become evidence of influence rather than evidence of failure. Once you understand Stanton, the film's emotional emphasis becomes clearer. Once you understand the production, the world building becomes more impressive. Once you understand the marketing, the confusion makes sense. Once you understand the economics, the box office collapse stops looking like proof that nobody wanted the movie. And once you understand the audience, you realize something else. People may not have known what John Carter was. But some of them wanted to find out. That curiosity is still alive. It is why the film keeps being rediscovered. It is why people still argue about it. It is why viewers who dismissed it years ago sometimes return and say, wait. This is actually pretty good. That sentence is not an insult to the people who criticized it originally. It is evidence that movies can change when their context changes. The film did not become better because the box office was forgotten. It became easier to see. The noise got quieter. The headlines stopped shouting. The movie could finally speak. And what it says is surprisingly simple. It says that a man can lose everything and still choose to care. It says that a dying world can still be beautiful. It says that ancient stories can survive long enough to become modern again. It says that influence can become invisible. It says that ambition can be messy. It says that corporations can spend enormous amounts of money and still misunderstand what they have. And maybe most importantly, it says that failure and value are not opposites. A movie can fail. A movie can matter. Both can be true. John Carter is proof. The financial loss was real. The marketing mistakes were real. The production problems were real. The criticisms were real. But so was the craft. So was the imagination. So was the emotional core. So was the memory. And that is why, more than a decade after its release, John Carter remains such an intriguing cinematic ghost. It did not become the franchise Disney wanted. It did not become the cultural phenomenon the studio hoped for. It did not dominate the box office. It did not redefine science fiction. But perhaps it did something quieter. It became a movie people could return to. A movie whose reputation could be questioned. A movie whose flaws could coexist with affection. A movie that reminds us that Hollywood history is not made only of winners. Sometimes the failures tell us more. They reveal what studios were afraid of. They reveal what audiences were tired of. They reveal what technology could do. They reveal what marketing could not communicate. And they reveal the kinds of stories that become harder to make when the business changes. John Carter is one of those stories. It is a relic. But not a useless one. A relic can tell you what a culture once valued. Barsoom tells us that audiences once had room for enormous worlds that did not arrive with decades of branding. Carter tells us that a blockbuster hero could be defined by grief rather than ambition. The Tharks tell us that visual effects can create characters rather than merely spectacle. Giacchino's score tells us that music can give an invented civilization emotional history. And the failure itself tells us that Hollywood was learning to fear uncertainty. That is why the movie's story is bigger than the movie. It is about a transition. Old Hollywood did not disappear in one night. It faded through decisions. One studio chose the safer property. Another canceled the risky project. Another demanded a sequel. Another asked for a recognizable star. Another redesigned the poster. Another changed the title. Eventually, the system changed. John Carter happened to arrive near the fault line. And because it was so expensive, its failure became impossible to ignore. The movie became a warning. But warnings are complicated. Sometimes the thing you are warned away from is exactly the thing you needed. If John Carter taught Hollywood anything, it may have been that massive original blockbusters are dangerous. But perhaps the wrong lesson was learned. Maybe the lesson should have been that original blockbusters need identity. They need confidence. They need marketing that understands what makes them different. They need studios willing to explain unfamiliar worlds without apologizing for them. They need budgets that match uncertainty. And they need filmmakers whose ambition is supported rather than constantly forced into corporate categories. John Carter had ambition. It had talent. It had a world. What it lacked was alignment. The filmmakers, the studio, the marketing, and the audience were never fully looking at the same movie. And when that happens, even a beautiful film can disappear. That is the heartbreak. Not that nobody cared, but that the people who needed to care about different parts of it were never given the same reason to care. The audience saw confusion. The studio saw risk. The critics saw uneven execution. The filmmakers saw an epic. The accountants saw a loss. And years later, some viewers see something else. They see home. Not literally, but emotionally. They see a movie from a particular period of their life. They remember being young enough to believe every strange creature might be the beginning of a new favorite franchise. They remember the posters, the trailers, the television commercials, the conversations at school, the strange feeling of watching something that seemed enormous and important even when nobody else seemed to understand it. That is why your nostalgia makes sense. You are not necessarily nostalgic for the box office failure. You are nostalgic for the possibility. The possibility that this strange movie could become something huge. The possibility that Barsoom might become the next place you return to every few years. The possibility that Carter, Dejah, and Tars Tarkas would become familiar names. The possibility that there would be another adventure. That possibility disappeared when the movie failed. And that absence is part of the emotional experience. A franchise gives you continuity. A failed franchise gives you imagination. You get to wonder what might have happened. What would a sequel have looked like? Would the characters have become stronger? Would Stanton have refined his live-action instincts? Would the world have become easier to understand? Would the marketing have learned how to sell it? Would audiences have accepted Barsoom after one successful sequel? We will never know. And perhaps that is part of why the movie feels haunting. It is a complete story surrounded by an incomplete future. The world feels bigger than the film. The characters feel capable of continuing. The mythology feels unfinished. And then reality interrupts. The box office says no. The franchise ends. The museum closes. But the artifact remains. You can still watch it. You can still hear the score. You can still see the Tharks. You can still watch Carter leap. And for a couple of hours, the alternate future is still possible. That may be the greatest gift a failed blockbuster can leave behind. Not success. Possibility. And if you were one of those kids who looked at the poster in 2012 and thought, I have absolutely no idea what this is, but it looks kind of awesome, maybe that was enough. Maybe your instinct was right. Maybe the movie was always going to be difficult to sell. Maybe the adults in the marketing departments were asking the wrong question. They asked, how do we make people understand John Carter? The better question might have been, how do we make people curious about Barsoom? Because curiosity is where adventure begins. And John Carter, for all its flaws, still has that. It still has the ability to make you look at a strange landscape and wonder what is beyond the horizon. It still has creatures that feel different. It still has a hero who has to rediscover the reason to live. It still has music that makes an unfamiliar world feel ancient. It still has the ambition to believe that an audience might be willing to enter somewhere they had never been before. That is not a small thing. In fact, it may be the thing we miss most. The willingness to walk into a theater without knowing exactly what we were going to get. The willingness to let a movie surprise us. The willingness to learn a world instead of recognizing one. John Carter failed to become the blockbuster event Disney wanted. But perhaps it accidentally became something else. A reminder. A reminder that originality can look derivative when you encounter it too late. A reminder that marketing can destroy clarity even when the product itself has personality. A reminder that a financial failure can contain genuine artistic achievement. And a reminder that the movies we love are not always the movies that win. Sometimes they are the ones that survive. John Carter survived. Barsoom survived. The memory survived. And now, years later, we can finally stop asking whether the movie was a failure long enough to ask a more interesting question. What did we lose when it failed? We lost the chance to see where that world might have gone. We lost the chance to watch a filmmaker grow inside live action. We lost another kind of blockbuster, one built around discovery rather than familiarity. We lost a possible franchise before audiences had enough time to decide whether they wanted one. And perhaps most importantly, we lost an example of what happens when an old story is given modern technology without being completely stripped of its old-fashioned soul. That is why John Carter still deserves a seat at the table. Not as the greatest movie Disney ever made. Not as the greatest science fiction film ever produced. Not even as the masterpiece its most devoted defenders sometimes imagine. But as something rarer. A movie that is easier to appreciate after you understand why it failed. A movie whose flaws tell us something about its era. A movie whose strengths become clearer with distance. A movie that looked backward while Hollywood was racing forward. A movie about a man who had lost his world, arriving on another world that was also dying. That parallel is almost too perfect. Carter begins the story believing there is nothing left for him. Barsoom is a planet struggling to survive. Both are waiting to discover whether they have a future. And the movie's answer is not certainty. It is choice. Carter chooses to care. Barsoom keeps fighting. The characters keep moving. The world keeps turning. Even after the box office says the story is over. And maybe that is why the movie continues to feel alive. Because every time somebody watches it again, Barsoom gets another chance. The theater may have gone quiet. The franchise may have disappeared. The headlines may have moved on. But the movie is still there. Waiting. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about a lost classic is that you do not have to pretend it was never lost. You can admit that it failed. You can understand why. You can study every mistake. And then you can turn the lights down, press play, hear that first swell of music, and let yourself believe in Barsoom again. For a movie that spent so much money trying to become a phenomenon, that may be the most fitting legacy of all. Not a billion-dollar franchise. Not a cinematic universe. Just a world that somebody remembers.